I just pushed record, so we are recording. So I think the reading is quite timely, right? We're talking about the ballot or the bullet. We're talking about voting. We're talking about political power. And we're using one of my favorite ancestors, El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, Brother Omawali, to lend our analysis or to, guide our analysis. So this speech was given in Detroit on April 3rd of 1964. So we're locating ourselves in the early 1960s. He has just been split from the Nation of Islam, and he's establishing his own temple, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and he's establishing his own organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And these are one of the speeches that he's giving at the time that he's forming these new organizations. So some of the themes that we kind of hear through the speech, right, is the idea of politics and religion, right, or your national identity and religion, right? So, he says, I'm a Muslim, but just because I'm a Muslim doesn't mean I can't organize with other Christians for the advancement of Black people, right? He mentions all these other civil rights leaders who are Christian preachers, Martin Luther King being one of them, but they're involved in civil rights activity, right? So what he feels that while he was with the Nation of Islam, which is a religious organization, he wasn't able to engage in the political activity of the civil rights movement. Now that he's broken from the Nation of Islam, he's going to be willing to engage in those struggles, and he doesn't want religion to be something that prevents people from engaging in the civil rights struggles. So there's this thing we have called the Black radical tradition. And it's also, we're in the Pan-African Studies department, right? So a Pan-African way of thinking is focusing on the similarities of people opposed to the differences, right? And so when you hear Malcolm, he's talking about what's going on in Asia, how they're able to throw off colonialism. He's talking about Africa, what's going on there and how they're able to throw off colonialism, right? So he's not focusing on how these areas are different, but he's focusing on the similarities, and that similarity is anti-colonial struggles. He talks about, he uses quite a bit this term Black nationalism, right? So it's important to understand what Black nationalism is, because that's really a main component of his argument in the speech, right? The importance of Black nationalism. He also looks at this notion of voting from, I think, a different perspective than most, right? He talks about a Black voting bloc. So not voting from the standpoint of I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. You're voting because you're Black, right? This is what's going to guide how you vote. How will this vote increase the sustainability or increase the living conditions of Black people should be what's guiding your vote. Not that I'm a Democrat, not that I'm a Republican, etc., right? He talks about how there's a lack of economic stability within the Black community, right? Part of that is due to Black people don't spend their money with Black people. Part of that issue is due to the fact that there are no Black businesses within the Black community for them to spend their money at. So I want to point out with that analysis, right? So mind you, he was coming from the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam had their base in Chicago, right? And on the south side of Chicago, a lot of the businesses that were owned in that area were Nation of Islam businesses. So when you went to the cleaners, a vast majority of the cleaners were Nation of Islam. When you went to restaurants, a vast majority of restaurants were Nation of Islam, right? All the little shops that you would need just in your normal community, vast majority of those shops were ran by the Nation of Islam. So when Malcolm is talking about the Black dollar being able to be circulated within the Black community, he's not just theorizing, right? He's seen this play out in real time. He knows how this could work because he came from an organization that was doing this very effectively for a good 40, 50 years, 30, 40 years, excuse me. Also, how many of you guys read it and how many of you guys listened to the speech? Show of hands or a head nod, or how many of y'all did both? For
I
those,
listened to it.
you listened to it.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who did both?
I listened to it and then kind of skimmed through the reading.
So Valeria, because I kind of did the same thing. Did you notice a difference between reading it and then hearing him speak? Can you kind of speak to that for us?
Um, some of it was kind of written differently, or it didn't quite match up exactly, but it still hit the same points.
Is there anything that stood out to anyone who heard the speech opposed to reading it? Was there anything that was like, this kind of leaps off the screen for me? No? So for me, you hear an urgency in his voice, right? It's not a something that we could have happen over a 10 years time span. He wants this to happen now, right? Also, and you'll see this next week when we listen to Martin Luther King, he's not your Southern preacher, and he doesn't speak like that. He's from New York, from Harlem, New York, right? If you think about Malcolm's background, he started off as Detroit Red, right? Out of Detroit. He was a hustler, what we would call a hustler nowadays, right? He sold drugs, he pimped women, right? He robbed buildings. This is his history, this is his background. Due to those activities, he spent time in prison, right? And in prison, he was introduced to the Nation of Islam. And when he got out of prison, he organized, I want to say for a 12-year period, through the Nation of Islam in the northern parts of America, predominantly Harlem. So during his time as a hustler, right, he learned street lingo, right? He knows how the streets move. Now that he's a minister for the Nation of Islam, and now that he's running his own organization, he hasn't left the streets behind, right? He talks in the same diction that the streets talks, right? You hear a little bit of rhyming in some of his speech patterns. Keep this in the back of your mind as we go into next week, and we're going to do a juxtaposition between how Martin Luther King sounds juxtaposed to how Malcolm X sounds. He is very much about this notion of self-help, right? Even some of his critiques of the process of voting is because we're looking for somebody to come and alleviate our issues. He's advocating for Black folks to do for yourself, right? He's also attentive to the global liberation. So again, he's talking about how China is throwing off the colonial powers. He's talking about how Africa is throwing off the colonial powers. He's talking about how Cuba and South America is throwing off the colonial powers. This was in April. I don't know if he's either coming back from traveling abroad in Africa or he's on his way to travel abroad in Africa, but one of the two. So he's attentive to what's going on in the globe, right? And again, what's happening across the globe are anti-colonial struggles. And so what you see Malcolm do is he takes this global analysis and applies it to Black folks' situation in the United States. And he articulates that Black people are in a colonial situation within the confines of the United States, right? And he even says that, we occupy a second-class citizenship. A second-class citizenship is equal to colonialism, right? So he's pegging the United States as a colonial entity and a colonial empire. You don't often hear the United States framed like that. The primary issue in the United States they often articulate is a race issue, not a colonial issue, but Malcolm is saying it's the same, right? But if you think about to this country's origin, it starts off with the 13 colonies, right? So this speaks to the colonial vestiges that are present in this country. He's also very attentive to the mood of the youth, right? So I mentioned the urgency that he's speaking of when you hear his speech, right? He wants it to be done now. And he's saying also the youth in the street have the same urgency. They're beginning to get tired of the civil rights sit-in movements, the civil rights movements that wants to sing and do the kumbaya, right? The youth are ready for some action. Keep this in mind. This speech was given in 1964. The birth of the Black Panthers is in 1968, right? So this is 4 years prior to the Black Panther movement. And when he's talking about these youth that are impatient and these youth that if the racial issues in America aren't addressed will come and riot and burn the streets down, he's in effect speaking of the Black Panthers who will come 4 years later. He also talks about this neoliberal critique, right? He talks about the March on Washington. How are you going to have a march, a protest, or a rally when the people who you are protesting are telling you where to march and where to rally, right? So this is a critique of neoliberalism. He also mentions how back in those times, right, he says that the white vote is so evenly divided, right? It always takes the Black vote to be the swing vote. So whoever the Black folks vote for, because the white vote being so split down the middle, is going to determine who's placed in office, right? Historically, we have voted for the Democratic Party. So those times that you see the Democratic Party placed in office, under his assertion, those is due to the Black vote. So what he sees is what the political parties like to do is bring celebrities and get them to sway the Black vote, right? So back in those times, you think of people like Harry Belafonte, right? Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, was a staunch Republican. So they would use these individuals to try to swing the Black vote one way or another. Now, if we look at our time today, how different is that, right? I've seen 2 Chainz at the Democratic rally, and then I seen a Little Pimp, or he mistakenly called, or Little Pump at the Republican rally, right? So they're still using the same tricks of taking these celebrities, placing them in front of us, trying to garnish our votes. And he says, because of this, Black folks lack a political maturity. And I can't argue with that because, again, this is since 1964. They're doing the same shit in 1920, I'm sorry, in 2020, and we're continuing to fall for the same tricks. I'll get back to that. Let me see. Another thing that, you know, within the speech, but then within Malcolm as a whole. So when we talk about Baldwin, right? I gave you guys Baldwin's pillars of white supremacy. So if you are to kind of take that concept of the pillars and apply it to Malcolm, I would say that there's 2 pillars that apply to Malcolm X. One of those pillars is truth, right? Truth was his guiding principle. Another one of those pillars is transformation, right? And I've already articulated how he transformed from Detroit Red to Malcolm X, right? And then from Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam to El-Hajj Malik Shabazz outside the Nation of Islam, and kind of cultivating his own organization. Those show signs of transformation, right? But that transformation was guided by truth. So when he was Detroit Red and he was put in prison and he was introduced to Islam, that was a truth that caused him to change the way that he lived his life, right? Once he found out that Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam, was not living up to the ideals that he was propagating to his followers, Malcolm left the Nation of Islam because he felt Elijah Muhammad was not moving through truth, right? While he was under the Nation of Islam, he was very much against integrationists. So people whose strategy was to integrate into American society, he was not a believer of that. He was a separationist, right? And because of that, he was very critical of individuals like Martin Luther King, talk hella shit about them, right? But once he found a new truth, he changed his position on how he viewed them. And he was even open to organizing with these individuals, right? In his speech, he says, you know, Martin Luther King, his strategy is integration, right? My strategy is separation, but our goal is the same thing. It's freedom, right? So you see a shift in the way that he views the civil rights struggle and integrationist action. He also offers a collective notion of freedom, right? So he's not thinking about freedom just for him or freedom just for Blacks in America. He's looking at global freedom for all African people. Again, a Pan-African notion of freedom. Also, there's an apocalyptic prophecy that you hear underlying in his speech. What do I mean by apocalyptic prophecy? What does the apocalypse or the apocalypse invoke? So what is the apocalypse? Think
So
about, Great.
Oh, sorry.
No,
Isn't it like the end of the world or something?
absolutely. Absolutely, Cecilia. That's what the apocalypse is, right? So what Malcolm is predicting is an apocalyptic prophecy, or prophecy is looking into the future and making a prediction, right? So what Malcolm's apocalyptic prophecy entails, if America does not address its racial issues, if America does not do right by African people in America, America is going to burn, right? That's what he says, this long, hot summer of 64, right? The racial powder keg is more dangerous than, it's the most dangerous powder keg there is, right? So this is that's the prophecy that he's predicting. Um, all right. We'll do this. Did everybody, so he uses this term, the Dixiecrats and the Democrats. Did everyone get the distinction that he was trying to make with that? Did everyone understand that part of his argument? Or if you didn't, let's clarify it so that way you understand, because it's a very fundamental part of his argument. The separation between the Dixiecrats and the Democrats. Yes, no, maybe, kind of.
Yeah, maybe. Isn't it just like kind of like the Democrats, just more primarily in the South, I would assume?
Absolutely. So Miracle, what is he saying with that though? What is his argument? Or Valeria, I see you unmuted yourself also.
Well, I was just gonna say, because on the reading it said that they were Democrats in disguise, but I didn't understand how. I'm trying to further expand on that idea.
Perfect. That's a very good question. So one, temporality becomes important when understanding what he's saying. And when I say temporality, that just means time, okay? So keep in mind, we're in 1964. This is what we're reading, this is where we have to place ourselves. So what's going on in 1964, right? It's the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement is largely happening in the South. So a lot of the ways that people understand racism is as racism being a Southern phenomenon, right? If you want to escape the racism, where do you go? Up north, right? So you don't think that the Northern politicians are racist because the North is not racist. What Malcolm is saying is nah, that's not the case, right? These Dixiecrats in the South, these Southern politicians who are Democrat, are just as racist as these Northern Democrats, right? There's no difference. They're two sides to the same coin, right? He talks about how when Lyndon B. Johnson was elected president because of the death of John F. Kennedy, who he relied on, who he called for his vice president, was a Southern Dixiecrat, right? And this particular Southern Dixiecrat, I believe, was from Georgia. And he was one of the foremost individuals who were against the civil rights struggle, right? So what Malcolm is saying, so as Black folks, if we always voting Democrat, because they're supposed to be the least racist of the two, right? But then these Democrats will go and get Southern Dixiecrats to run political business as well. So how could we be as foolish to think that these Democrats in the North aren't as racist as these Dixiecrats in the South, right? So it makes a little bit less sense in our now because the division between the North and South is not seen the way that it was seen in 64. But what Malcolm is arguing is that don't get confused by thinking that these politicians are in the North aren't as racist as these politicians in the South. He said, in fact, if you're south of the Canadian border, you South, right? It's just as racist, it doesn't matter. So my last point is this. Before Malcolm makes this transition in 65, I believe it is. Yes, he's born in 25, he died in 65, 40 years old. So before he makes his transition in 65, his project was to take the plight of Black folks to the UN and charge America with human rights violations, right? Does that make sense to everybody? He wants to take the Black folks situation in America, take America to court, to the United Nations for human rights violations, right? So again, think about what I was saying earlier. What's going on in 64? The primary focus of organization for Black folks at that time is what? Civil rights. So Malcolm's like, we are dealing with a human rights issue, right? The right to breathe is a human rights issue, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's think about our now. We're in the time of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? What is the term Black Lives Matter invoking or getting someone to think about or to understand?
That Black Lives Matter too, and that we need to all be on like a equal level, like playing field per se, because we've always been below in the US.
Absolutely. So if we have to say as a people that our lives matter, implicitly, what does that mean? Because if you have to say it, that means what?
It means that the government's not doing anything about.
Absolutely. So that means there's a segment of society that views Black lives as not mattering, right? So at that point, this becomes a human rights issue. Even the terminology, the verbiage, the vocabulary of the Black Lives Matter movement is a human rights issue movement, right? The term that says, I can't breathe, right? You have people walking around with signs and masks that say, I can't breathe. The ability to breathe is a human rights issue, right? So we have a slogan that, in fact, affirms that we aren't human in this society, right? Or we're not viewed as human in this society because even our breathing, our ability to breathe is questioned as suspect, right? So what sense does this make to take these human rights issues before civil rights courts, right? And this is what Malcolm is trying to get us to think about. Take it a step further. He says, what sense does it make to take the criminal to the criminal's court, right? And this is what we do. We have a police kill somebody, and we're expecting the justice system that the police work for to give us justice. Does that make sense? Nah. If my son punched you in the face, and you come tell me my son punched, I'm gonna be like, yo, that's my son. I'm gonna take my son's side, not yours, right? It's the same premise. The allegiance of these people who we are expecting to give us justice, their allegiance is to the police. So how much justice are we gonna get from a system that's doing us wrong? So Malcolm is saying, we need to make this a human rights issue. So this becomes his project towards the later years of his life, right? When he's traveling abroad in Africa, his goal is to make African heads of state see that the Black people struggle in America, they're experiencing human rights violations, right? Think about this. The Nazi and Jewish conflict, right? That was a human rights issue. What the Jews were experiencing, the world recognized as a human rights issue to the point we had a world war, right? The whole world jumped in and fought a war because Jewish human rights were being violated. How does what the Jews went through, and I'm not here to play oppression Olympics, but just to kind of get you to think about it, right? So how is it this one group of people, their human rights is enough to ensue a world war, and Black folks have been dealing with these issues far longer than what the Jewish situation was, right? And we've gotten to the point in our now, in 2020, to all that we could say and all that we could advocate for is Black lives to matter, or let us breathe, right? So there's something going on where we're not getting the same global respect that that Jewish community received in their time. So what Malcolm's goal became was to make sure that we got a global audience that understood our plight, right? He spent a lot of time in Ghana. Ghana was one of the first countries in Africa to receive their liberation. His objective was to establish connective lines of communication to where when something happens to Black folks in America, we can send communication to Ghana for support, right? So this is the things that Malcolm was up to towards the end of his life. And I think as a people, and not only Black people, all oppressed people, right? We're missing a step by continuing, one, to take our enemies to the enemy court. That's one mistake, right? And we're still playing this game of civil rights, and we're not looking at the broader context of this being a human rights issue. So those are the things that I found of interest. With the last moments that with the time that we have left, we'll do a fishbowl and we'll open up to a broader conversation. I went over who fishbowl last week, so you guys should have a kind of idea. If you heard your name, then you're good. If not, don't worry about it. I'll read through it one more time. Again, it's a list of everybody, not just Group B. So Cassandra, Eileen, Cecilia, Douglas, Oscar, Melissa, Diana, Chelsea, Christian, Emily, Precious, Miracle, Valeria, Cecilia, Ariane, Andrea, Wasan, George, Mariana, Valeria, Samantha, Emily, Lizette, Yoko, Sandy, Alyssa, Jocelyn, Montserrat, Ingrid, Eileen, Esperanza, Carissa, Helena, Sherlyn, Chris, George, Yaneli, Jocelyn, Jimena, and Brissa. If you did not hear your name, I would suggest you volunteer to Fishbowl. If you did, don't worry about it, you're good to go. I think most of you guys on here are good. Did anybody not hear their name and anybody want to volunteer? All right. So let's just open up to a broader conversation. What are you guys' thoughts about the reading? Again, keep in mind what we're going through as a society right now, what Malcolm is talking about, they align very closely. So we could talk about some of the things that I mentioned. We could kind of blend what Malcolm's talking about with our now, or just anything you guys find of interest. We'll go ahead and open it up to you. Anybody?
Well, I'll go. Well, I found it interesting as I was listening to the audio and skimming through the reading, how a lot of what he says does relate to what's going on today. And I didn't quite pay attention to it, but I do remember him stating something about some polls from back then. And it also kind of fit into the polls from today.
Yep. Yeah, he's actually talking about voter suppression. Like just how we're going in our now, that's what's going on in 64, right? Like Black folks not being able to get to the polls to vote, right? Same scenario.
Yeah, and then I also wanted to touch on what you said, how like you compared it to what happened with the Nazis and the Jews, how that created the war, but like African American people have been going through the same stuff even before that. And it's also similar like with other races and other groups. In another class, we talked about Asian Americans and how they also went to camps.
Yep.
And a lot was done for them, but we still see nothing being done for African Americans today.
Yep.
So it's incredible to see this pattern continue through different race groups, yet nothing's done for that specific group.
Very good point, Valeria. Have anybody heard of the term reparations?
Yes.
Can you kind of speak on what you know about reparations? What is that?
Okay, so like at least what I know is that it's kind of like paying back Black people for like everything that happened. So like for instance, there was a mayor, I don't know what state it was someone in the South, and they said give money to Black people, so like reparations for what we went through and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So the premise is, so we worked enslavement for over 300 years. So because of that, we weren't paid or compensated for that labor. Not only the United States, but the whole Western world, Europe included, right, received tremendous amounts of wealth because of that labor. So the idea of reparations is just to pay back the unpaid labor that Black folks gave to the Western world, right? It was articulated at that time as 40 acres of land and a mule to get to work the land. And that would equate to an equal amount of payout for the labor that Black folks put forth into this country. Also, within that is to atone for the atrocities that Black people went through, right? The violence that we endured and things of that nature. So we have not received that. Miracle, have you received any reparations? Does anybody that you know receive any reparations?
No.
Nah, me neither. There's a lot of conversation, especially as of late, around this idea of reparations. If you guys were paying attention to the early conversations around political candidates, they all had to address this idea of reparations, right? The excuses that we are offered as to why we cannot pay out the reparations. Well, we don't know how much money would be to give out to each individual. How do you determine who should receive reparations? Where people don't want to pay out of their taxes for reparations. So these are some of the excuses that they give as it pertains to Black reparations. Valeria mentioned the Chinese internment camps that they received, or that they were placed in, right? There was some financial allocation paid out for that atrocity to the Asian community, right? To this day, the United States is paying reparation to the state of Israel for what they went through. Somebody answer me, what does the United States have to do with the situation that the Jews went through? So what was the United States' role in oppressing or subjugating the Jews during their time of the Holocaust?
Isn't it because Hitler got the idea from the US? Or not the, yeah, isn't that it?
No, you're absolutely right. And so that's the only connection right there, is because Hitler studied how to subjugate people in the United States. So the ideas that he got on how to subjugate the Jews, he learned from here, right? So that's the only connection, right? But the United States is paying money to Israel to this day. If you are to research how much money the United States sends to Israeli Defense Fund, to the Israeli army, it is billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. Look it up. So how is it reasonable that the American governmental institution has money to send to Israel, right? But you cannot find any money to give to Black people. So that kind of goes to what Valerie is saying. You're absolutely right, right? So if something comes different when it comes to addressing Black grievances, right? People get hella stingy when it's time to address Black grievances. You all, and I'm gonna preface this by saying I don't excuse the Native Americans being placed on reservation. I don't excuse the indigenous people being placed in reservations. That does not absolve the debt of what they went through, right? But they received their reparations also in the form of these casinos, in the form of these land, right? So at least you see them trying to make an atonement for their action. And when I say they, I'm talking about the United States, right? But for some reason, when it gets to the Black body, everybody's pockets get real deep and arms get real short. Good point, Valeria. Who else?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Jocelyn.
Oh, I have a question actually.
Okay.
Do you think the US government or just people in general get stingy about reparations to Black people is because if they give reparations to Black people, like it kind of admits not only like all the terrors and atrocities they've done, but how long they've done it, like about 200, 300 years. I mean, I know like the Asian community for the Japanese internment and like the Jewish community or whatever, that was more recent. So it's like, oh, like it just happened, but like if you compare the Native Americans and the Black people together in terms of a timeline somewhat, I feel like the main difference between the two is that there's not that much of a population of Native Americans in comparison to Black people. So it's like harder to dismiss all those numerous amounts of Black people and their ancestors and even today that they've treated so terribly versus like the Native Americans. Oh, it's a small group that's been like suffering just under the corner for the same time, but whatever, they're smaller to take care of versus all those people they have to acknowledge. Do you think that's part of the reason why they won't reprimand, or?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Jocelyn. And then too, so like to do that, not only is to admit, but then that's also to undermine and upend the whole foundation of what this society is built on, right? So if you're gonna admit that, you gotta start looking at things totally differently, right? So even think about this, think about the conversation around taking down monuments, right? That we deem racist in our current time. The counter argument to that is, nah, they're not racism, it's our heritage, right? This is how they say we should keep them up because it's Southern heritage, right? So if we are to start playing that game and start paying back Black folks for what they went through, this notion of an American heritage, this notion of American patriotism, right? This notion of the American ideal, that becomes not so wholesome, right? It becomes problematic at that point. So to do that, to acknowledge these things, is to undermine the very foundation of what American society is, right? You can't say make America great again when you know that America is only great because of the work of enslaved Africans, right? So I think you're spot on with that. And then to go back to Baldwin, right? If one of the pillars of white inferiority is to maintain innocence, you cannot admit guilt. And to pay out reparations is to effectively admit guilt. So that's a very good point. Who else?
Kind of adding on to this notion of patriotism, one thing that stood out, I don't know if you mentioned, was how he mentioned in his speech that he doesn't consider himself American, and how it's kind of hard to wave that flag when, you know, blood is at the hands of those who made it and everything. So it's hard, you know, and even myself, it's hard to call myself American knowing that so many people are suffering just that build America, you know? It's really sad.
Yeah. And I mean, so to me, I found it hella ironic when they were talking about not flying the Confederate flag, right? And I'm like, okay, so if we're gonna play that game, what are we gonna do with the American flag? Because to me, what's the difference? One is just as racist as the other. As Malcolm said, right, we can't get caught up in the idea that only the racism is only a Southern problem. Again, if you south of the Canadian border, you south, right? So I don't consider myself an American, right? At best, I would say I'm an African in America, right? But American, no. And another thing that Malcolm famously says, you can't call yourself an American because if everybody at the table has a plate to eat, right? Everybody is sitting down grubbing. You pull yourself up to that table and you don't have a plate of food, are you eating? Nah. So although we're in America, right, we're not receiving the benefits of America. For us to vote, we had to die, right? For us to sit in some particular lunch counters, we had to die, right? For us to go to particular schools, we had to die. For us to live in certain areas, we had to die. So we did not innately receive the benefits of America. We had to fight, organize, and die and bleed for those benefits, right? So again, if you're at the table and you're not eating like everybody else, you're not eating. So if you're in this country and you don't reap the benefits of everyone else in this country, how American are you? So I think that's a very good point. It's a point that I agree with from Malcolm, you know. And I also think when you talk about this idea of civil rights issue and human rights issue, right? So for me, identifying myself as an African, although I'm in America, that connects me with Africans on the continent, that connects me with Africans in the Caribbean, that connects me with Africans in South America, right? So I have a broader international perspective of my place in the world, right? Just saying I'm American, that only limits me to a place that don't even want me here in the first place, right? So in the space of power, how much more power does it have to be a global African that's been dispersed all throughout the world, or to be African American that's just located within this situation that nobody fuck with anyway, right? So even from a political standpoint, it would be wise for Black folks to identify with your Africanity on a global scale. So with that being said, I think it's important that we address this notion of Black nationalism, right? And because when you hear nationalism in the context today, it has a very negative connotation. So tell me, what does nationalism mean in our American context? When you hear an American nationalist, what images does that invoke for you?
Hello?
A white person.
A white person? What were you gonna say, Jocelyn?
I was gonna say, when I think of nationalism in America, I think of it as like, well, supremacy in a way, and like over proudness, because there's a difference between being proud of your heritage and like thinking your heritage or whatever backstory or whatever background is the best one. Like, we are the best. And in terms, if you're saying we're the best, that means other people are lesser than you.
Johnson, what you have for breakfast? Because whatever you had is working for you. You own today. You're absolutely right, right? So when I think about nationalism in the American context, I think about the Proud Boys. I think about the Boogaloo Boys. I think about these far-right, alt-right groups that are, to Johnson's point, white supremacists or white inferiorities, right? So this is this concept of nationalism in our now, right? But what Malcolm is talking about is a Black nationalism. So what do you think he means by that, or what do you think that means? So if this is what white nationalism looks like is the Proud Boys, what does Black nationalism look like? Not rhetorical. What does it mean, or what do you think it would mean to be a Black nationalist?
Well, what I think so far is that being a Black nationalist would be taking pride and not feeling like ashamed and embarrassed, like how white supremacist and society has taught most people to feel about Black people, or even Black people to feel about themselves. And also in like, instead of, in comparison to the white supremacist, I know you can't really compare the two, but like how white people or white supremacists base it off of like superiority, and that power dynamic is they want more and more and more power. But for a Black nationalist, it would be reclaiming things and empowering things and feeling good about the things that society's taught them to be feeling bad about, and healing from all the traumas and wrongs that society has in place upon them.
I couldn't say it better myself, Jocelyn. So, and be honest, right? Like, so now that you have a definition and you have somewhat of a working understanding, upon reading this, did anybody think something different? Did anybody feel uncomfortable about the term Black nationalism? Did it feel threatened or, intimidated even by that terminology? Okay, so I'm gonna assume that's a no. That's good, because I think that's one of the things that often gets misinterpreted when you read this the speech, right? People want to equate Black nationalism to white supremacy, and as Jocelyn articulated masterfully, it's vastly different, right? So what Malcolm is advocating for, instead of me voting as a Democrat, instead of me voting as a Republican, I'm gonna vote for as a Black person. I'm gonna vote for whatever party that's gonna advance my situation, right? You're gonna put your Blackness as priority than all the other things or the other identifiers that you may have, right? So before I'm a man, I'm a Black man, right? Before I'm heteronormative, I'm Black, right? So that's gonna be the guiding force that's gonna determine my decision making, right? So he's advocating for us to put everything to the side, your religion, right? I'm not going to worry about you being Christian, me being Islam, because right now we need to focus on the Black issue, right? So this is what this kind of idea of Black nationalism is doing things to advance your situation, right? Also, somewhat of a precursor to Black power, which you'll see articulated by Kwame Ture and the Black Panther Party a few years later. Any last questions, comments, concerns? Melissa, we haven't heard from you. Precious, we haven't heard from you. Douglas, we have not heard from you. So why don't you guys close this out?
Well, when I was reading it, I saw in the 5th paragraph, I think, he explains how you were going to have to be forced to use the ballot or the bullet. And I thought that meant like we either turn it out to have a government that works for our favor, or to use a bullet, not necessarily an actual bullet, but like protests to actually create change.
Yeah, and it may be an actual bullet too. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Melissa? Melissa? All right, Helena, how about you?
When reading it, I kind of took it as, when he's watching it, like inspiration towards the Black people. And I kind of want to relate it to how what they're fighting for is basic human rights. And for our elections, like if Biden were to win, people are going to protest just because they're racist and they want Trump to win, which is so unfair when if Trump to win, so many people are going to lose so much, which is really scary.
Yeah, very good point. Douglas, you want to close this out?
Yeah, I wanted to like bring up a point. Like I was going off of like what you said, of like how Black people will like vote for someone that's gonna make a change. Is that like how what Ice Cube was trying to do with Trump?
Yeah. So just to kind of articulate, so you guys understand. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with what's going on with Ice Cube. So what he has put together is called a contract with Black America, right? And he went before Team Biden and tried to discuss the contract with them. They told him no. They said, we'll just meet with you after the election. So then he went to the Republican Party and said, you know, I want to meet with you about this contract I have with Black America. They were open to meeting, right? Through this, Trump came up with this idea of the Platinum Plan, which is his plan for Black America, right? I'm not saying I agree with Trump. I don't believe that he would even go through with the Platinum Plan. But I do feel that at least Trump is showing that he's willing to listen, right? Because what sense does it make for you to meet with me when the election is over? You're already in office, right? So you already have my vote. So what Ice Cube was trying to do is what's called is a bipartisan issue, right? So it's not about the Democratic Party, it's not about the Republican Party. This is a bipartisan issue. So whoever is going to, again, advance the situation of Black folks, I'm riding with. And that's what Ice Cube was trying to do. And I think when Malcolm talks about the political immaturity, you see that in play with the Ice Cube situation. So now everybody's saying the Ice Cube is voting for Trump. He never said that. He said, I'm gonna sit down with both of these motherfuckers and see who has the best conversation about us. And then based on that, that's who I'm gonna support, right? How is that foolish? How is that being a sellout, right? It's smarter.
He's getting a lot of hate for that.
Yeah, he's getting a lot of hate for that. And it's like, if you know Ice Cube, right? If you know like NWA Ice Cube, this all makes sense, right? So that's a very good point, Douglas. And that's a great way to bring what you read into what's going on now to make sense of the analysis. So you're absolutely right. We'll end it there. You know, we're not out of water yet. It's looking good. But again, I